Funding for the production of Folks is made possible in part by a grant from Union National Life Insurance, serving Louisiana and the South since 1926. A family-managed corporation providing whole life insurance.
Straight ahead on Folks, Mary Frances Berry, United States Civil Rights Commissioner, talks candidly about what's happening to civil rights in the 80s and a special tribute to the memory of Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. on today's edition of Folks. Hello everyone, I'm Sonya Masingale. Welcome to another edition of Folks. Black people in America have overcome an amount of hardship and struggle that few other ethnic groups have ever undertaken to achieve equal status in American society. Today, in honor of the birthday celebration of Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., we're going to share with you a segment from last season on the past and present status of civil rights. Later on today, we'll share with you some highlights from an exhibit entitled Martin Luther King, Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. But first, Mary Frances Berry of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission was in New Orleans last year to address the American Civil Liberties Union. She shared with us her perspective on where the country stands on civil rights and the influences behind that stand.
Our president in Washington seems to be in very deep trouble. As I told and as I tell every reporter who asks me, it makes me so very sad.
There is no love lost between Mary Frances Berry and the Reagan Administration. She believes, as many prominent blacks and civil liberties organizations, that the Reagan administration is largely responsible for what seems to be a backslide of civil rights legislation.
Toward the tail end of the 1970s, there was a reaction against the civil rights changes and equal opportunity policy changes in the national government that had taken place as a result of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. I don't know exactly why that reaction came, but it did. Some people call it white backlash. Whether it came because of inflation, whether it came because of gas lines, whether it came because of people worrying about their own economic situation, or whether it came for any of those reasons, I don't know. But it happened.
Berry believes that it is the current social climate that is truly damaging civil rights.
And Mr. Reagan's presidency was the culmination of that sort of process. And then he simply extended it since he's been in office. He came into office feeling that he had a mandate from those people who didn't like very much all the progress that had been made, who thought that now, you know, what more do black people want? They've got all these changes. And Mr. Reagan, who after all was against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and who had been against civil rights policy changes in the national government as long as he could remember, simply went about implementing his negative mandate. And he had to help him a number of black folks who call themselves black conservatives, who've been out there sort of articulating the idea that, oh, Mr. Reagan's just fine. What he's doing is wonderful. And all these people who argue about, you know, what we should do in the black community is focus on self-help. Of course we should help ourselves. If we had not, we wouldn't be here as far as we've gotten. But we pay taxes, and the government has a responsibility too. So we got in all these debates.
Why does it seem that blacks are losing ground in the fight for equality?
Some black folk thought, well, I've got mine now as a result of the movement. Some went into politics. It's fine. Part of what the movement was about to go into politics. Others went into business. But we forgot about our nonviolent direct action protest tradition. And we forgot that politics is one way to make change, but protest is an essential ingredient of politics, and that the squeaky wheel indeed gets the oil. And so we sort of went to sleep, and all these changes took place, a reaction ensued, and poor black folks have suffered for it and continue to suffer, and even those who are middle class, who are a paycheck away from poverty, are indeed in a situation where they are suffering and will begin to suffer for it unless we do something. But I believe we will do something. I believe that we will reclaim our traditions. We have seen some of that in the last few years. We've seen it in boycott strategies, whether it is the fair share programs of NEACP putting pressure on companies, whether it is Operation Push and its latest, the Revlon thing. We've seen it in the Free South Africa movement, in which I happen to play a leadership role, in which we got mobilized people who are progressives across racial lines, the way we did in the civil rights movement, to come out and demand policy changes and demand that American companies get out of South Africa and so on. So there is a reservoir of understanding there that, yes, we must do this. And I believe that we will continue to move on and expand that tradition to put the pressure where it should be. And I also believe that we will begin, as we're starting to do, selectively using our vote and holding politicians accountable for what they do, and that we will begin to understand better what all these issues are, and that economics, we've been talking recently about how economics is the new, economics and politics are related, and we will learn, we'll put all that knowledge to use.
Will a return to nonviolent protest be the catalyst in improving the enforcement of civil rights legislation? After all, there has been some measurable progress in civil rights since the 50s. Controversial scenes such as these, when in 1957 3 black girls integrated the New Orleans public school system, have become for the most part history. In spite of attempts to dilute public school desegregation, thousands of black and white youngsters attend school peacefully together. There is also less discrimination in housing in most areas of the country. Middle-class families can live for the most part wherever they choose, regardless of race. And some of the very lunch counters that refuse to serve blacks are now run by blacks who serve customers of all races. The black middle class in America is definitely moving ahead. In 1984, blacks made up 19% of the share of persons 18 to 24 in college, compared to only 7% in 1964. In 1985, some 40% of all black workers performed white-collar jobs, compared to only 19% of black workers in white-collar jobs in 1965. And the overall poverty rate for blacks has decreased from 56.2% in 1959 to 33.8% in 1984. But the ugly specter of poverty just will not go away for many blacks. The unemployment rate of blacks has been consistently double that of whites in this country, and no one knows exactly how many blacks are caught in the web of joblessness, poverty, and despair in America today. What has the civil rights movement come to in the 1980s, and what is in the future for civil rights as we face the dawning of the 21st century, which is only 13 years away? Joining me in the studio to discuss this issue is A.Z. Young, Executive Assistant for Minority Affairs for Governor Edwards, and Cleo Fields, Executive Director of Young Adults for Positive Action and Senior Law Student at Southern University. Welcome to folks.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, Dr. Young, we used a tape segment from the Freedom March that you led in 1967 on the state capitol from Bogalusa to Baton Rouge. Do you agree that a return to that type of nonviolent protest is needed to regain or reclaim our civil rights?
I feel that the same strategy that we used even prior to 1967 should go back into existence. The black family, the black church, and the black community working together. We had a plan in operation that was very, very successful. We arrived at this point in time because of that particular strategy. I feel no use for alternate a plan that's designed and has worked successfully. I do believe in demonstrations. I believe in protests. I believe in picketing wherever the needs are there. But I do feel to believe, after all of these years, that we as a people must again come together and work in the best interest of ourselves.
Cleo, your involvement with civil rights has been a little more recent. You were one of the persons that was the moving force behind that 1982 voters registration drive that included the march from Shreveport to Baton Rouge. Am I right?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm curious as to whether you agree with Mr. Young. Do you think we can mobilize and make those things happen again?
I'm in concurrence with Mr. Young 100%. I think we need to move back to the civil rights days in terms of mobilizing people and also motivating people to move in the right direction. But I would take it a step further than that. I think we need to also use the legal system to the maximum of our ability and what have you in order to make sure that justice is in the educational system, is in the economic system, and what have you across the board. There is a dying need for the church to come together. There's a dying need for black people as a whole to come together and be about the business of taking care of business. And I think the only way we can bring about that kind of movement is, you know, like people like Dr. Young, A.Z. Young, who I so much admire and respect, start moving the masses of the people, because we're in trying times. We're in a position today that I don't think today is too much better or too much different from the 60s, because we're not facing discrimination and or facing injustice necessarily in a civil rights perspective, but we're facing it in the economic perspective more than any other place I can mention of.
Would you agree that it's the middle class are progressing, but it's the other people, the other black people, who are being systematically shut out of our institutions because of a lack of opportunity, that are suffering the most? What would you say to that?
I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think one of the ways we can bring about a social change across the board, and that is those persons who make it, those persons who are fortunate enough to get out of the ghettos and what have you, they need to be sensitive to the needs and concerns of those persons who are still down there. They need to be cognizant of the fact and need to also come back to the communities that they graduated from, per se, and pull somebody else along with them. You cannot be successful without pulling the people who you're surrounded with or have been surrounded with for years and years along with you. That's what I call a success. You know, I could not reach a success unless my peers are successful.
But this is the me generation. Mr. Young, would you comment on that? This is the me generation. We've left our neighborhoods for the most part. We don't live in the same place. We don't worship in the same churches. How are we going to get everybody back? I mean, what's going to be the motivation that's going to push people back into the traditional ways?
There is not a leader on the scene, as far as my knowledge, that could pull us back together on a moment's notice. But during the decade of the 1960s, there was several leaders that could have pulled us together because a commitment was there. The commitment is not there today as it was in the 1960s. And because of the commitment not being there, we seem to separate, because we have accomplished some things in life that we had no dream that we would ever accomplish. We live in separate communities, in integrated communities. We drive Mercedes and 2 different kinds of cars and trucks and boats. And as a result of that, we have forgotten where we come from. We have forgotten those persons who made it possible for us to be here. On Monday night, which is the celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday, I had several invitations from around the state to participate. When Bogalusa entered their name into the hat, then my choice was automatically Bogalusa, because Bogalusa sent me here. And this is what I think everybody's attitude should be, that we should go back home and participate, not only physically, but mentally, morally, and financially, to aid or assist that community in reaching those goals that we designed in the 1950s and 60s.
One of the things that we're hearing a lot from moderates who would see affirmative action laws struck down is that you cannot legislate human hearts. You can't make laws that will make people non-racist. Therefore, affirmative action isn't working, or it's working too slowly, and we should get rid of it. What do you have to say to something like that?
Well, in the first place, we wasn't looking for a love affair. We weren't looking for no romance. We were looking for some action to make our living conditions better. I'm a witness of affirmative action working in the best interest of not only black folks, but white folks also. I'm familiar with lawsuits that were designed to give blacks an opportunity to move up the progression line, because we had been discriminated for so long. Our counterparts had progressed 4 and 5 levels where we had sit in the same place for years. The affirmative action plan would pick a person from the minority group and move into a slot. If that person were not available, then we would look around in our communities until we found that person. And I do think that it made a difference. And today we are enjoying some benefits. We're enjoying a better relationship, blacks and whites together, because we have moved into a mainstream jointly and working together for the benefit of the United States of America.
Well, Cleo, some people say that affirmative action has helped those who needed it the least. For example, middle-class blacks, people who had a strong history of education in their families, were the ones who profited the most from affirmative action. Would you agree with that, and why?
Well, it's kind of a broad question, so to speak, but let me just give you my interpretation of affirmative action, because I feel that a lot of people have a misconception of affirmative action. First of all, you can't look at affirmative action as two parallel lines, which some people and most people look at it that way. You got to look at affirmative action as a circle, which means you have all of these individuals in this same circle who are equally qualified, and you're going to elevate the blacks or minorities to their rightful place, as the court has already acknowledged, in society in order for them to compete on the level of everybody else and anybody else. I think all too often people look at affirmative action as two parallel lines, and they say you're taking a unqualified or a less qualified minority and placing him in a position of a person who is more qualified than him, of a non-minority or what have you. I think we need affirmative action. I think affirmative action is one of the ways that the courts are going to justify the past discrimination that blacks and minorities alike have suffered over the years. So you cannot decide all of a sudden that, okay, blacks and minorities, you are now in the mainstream of society, and we're going to give you a rope. If you have a black and a white in a ditch, and the black is 3 feet further in that ditch than a white individual, and you say, hey, we're going to stop discriminating against anybody, and we're going to throw each of you a 5 feet rope, you know, the bottom line to that black may not ever reach the rope because he's 10 feet deeper in the hole than the white. So what I'm saying to you is, I think we need programs like affirmative action in order to bring about and not justify, but to combat past discrimination and put blacks and minorities in their rightful places.
Okay. Now, we're hearing a lot about self-help, all the black people, we need to help ourselves. But if we don't have some strong federal laws to support that help, it's not going to work. It's only going to go so far. So what can we do to keep those laws from being struck down? I mean, Mary Frances Berry said it, that the Reagan administration has ushered in a new climate of non-tolerance.
Well, the main thing that I feel that we can do, and I've always felt that this is the solution to our problem, registration to vote and educate our voters. Then we can solve any problem that we're confronted with. If we would register to vote and vote in a block, as we say it, I personally believe that numbers will change a politician. And politicians like numbers, and numbers decide who's elected. And we have the numbers that can make the big decision. And with those numbers, if the leadership that we elect could make certain that we enter the mainstream of this society.
Cleo, would you agree with that?
I would agree with it. I would agree with it wholeheartedly, but I would go a step further. When you look at self-help, you know, you may cry self-help and what have you, but I think we've been helping ourselves from day one without any questionable doubt. Just like Jesse said, and I think Jesse Jackson said it better than I can ever say it, we don't want welfare, we want our fair share. I think we need to be about the business of helping each other, and I think we've been about that business for a long, long time. I think we need to come a little bit closer in terms of into our churches and our communities and what have you, and give something back to the community after you receive so much from the community. I think that is very much needed, but I would not and cannot accept anyone making any blanket statement to the effect that we're not helping ourselves, because we've been helping ourselves when no one else would help us. And had we not helped ourselves in the past, then we wouldn't be where we are today.
You probably recognize Cleo Fields in that interview. He is now the youngest state senator in Louisiana, representing Baton Rouge, District 14. Our next segment features photographs from an exhibit called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. It's our tribute to the memory of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the eve of the national holiday honoring his birth. That's all for our program today. Thanks for joining us. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Funding for the production of Folks is made possible in part by a grant from Union National Life Insurance, serving Louisiana and the South since 1926, a family-managed corporation providing whole life insurance.